go to a marijuana doctor for a recommendation for. And you said that you've seen evidence that in neuropathic pain, it has some value. But what are the other types of pains? There's somatic and visceral pain as well. Why does it help neuropathic pain?
There are probably two answers to that question. In general, this is an oversimplification, but in general, I tend to think of two kinds of pain, meaning neuropathic pain and then everything else. And I think a pain specialist would probably be aghast that I've summarized most of their field of research and work in those overly simplistic terms. But sure. I think for most of us who practice clinically, we see a patient with pain and we try to figure out whether there's a component that's neuropathic that's due to nerve injury, because, as I said before, those are syndromes that tend not to respond well to opioids, and we have to treat them differently. For everybody else, there are nuances. Certainly, there are various approaches. There are lots of medications available. But in general, those sorts of pain, whether it's due to advanced cancer or a broken ankle or everything in between, tend to respond pretty well to Tylenol. Acetaminophen respond often well to nonsteroidals like ibuprofen. They usually respond really, really well to opioids like morphine or fentanyl. Not everybody, not all the time, but that trio of drugs plus a couple of others manage to get a lot of people very, very comfortable, often very quickly. So why doesn't marijuana work for those types of so-called nociceptive pain? Well, I'm still not sure we could say it doesn't work. Because neuropathic pain doesn't respond well to opioids, a lot of people like Barth Willsey, who I mentioned before, decided when they started studying medical marijuana for pain, decided to go after neuropathic pain because that's the kind of pain that often gives us a lot of trouble when we're trying to treat people. Whereas, somebody with a broken ankle, we know they're going to respond really, really well to morphine. There isn't that fairly urgent need to come up with new treatments as there is for neuropathic pain. So there haven't been as many studies in regular nociceptive pain, at least to my knowledge, for medical marijuana. But those studies that have been done have been, I think, to my way of thinking, kind of unimpressive. Mm. And also some laboratory studies. One commonly used lab study of pain uses a piece of metal that's been heated to a temperature that most people find uncomfortable. And then in a typical lab assay of pain, people are given various drugs to see whether it changes people's experience with that stimulus, whether people find it less bothersome, whether they can stand it for a longer period of time. And whereas drugs like opioids dramatically have an effect in those laboratory studies, marijuana seems not to. So it may be that there's some effect, but it doesn't seem to be nearly as great as far as I can tell, as other drugs like nonsteroidals or opioids.
Speaking of cannabis being able to kind of numb your senses or reactions, I'm not sure I'm using the right terminology here, but with PTSD, there was a study using color blocks where somebody got shocked if the color blue came up, and then they were given cannabis, and they were still aware that shock was coming, and it made them nervous, kind of a PTSD effect, but that was numbed by the cannabis. When we talk about PTSD, is that what we're talking about reacting to stimulus?
We are. So in general, when you're talking about PTSD, you're talking about intensely emotional memories that are linked to a particular stimulus. So if somebody's in a car accident, is trapped in a car for 15 or 20 minutes after the car rolls over, may for years afterwards feel very anxious and panicked in closed spaces. That's an oversimplification, but not a bad summary of PTSD. So it has to do with emotional memories. The study you mentioned was done by a woman named Christine Rabenak. A couple of slight changes. So the study she did was, as you said, showing people colored squares. Then she would subject those research subjects not to a shock, but to a loud noise. So not painful, not uncomfortable, but kind of surprising. And she gave them not cannabis, but pure THC. And what she found was that, in general, as people are exposed to these squares, they develop this anxious response when they see squares that are normally associated with a loud noise. As she stopped giving them that loud noise, in general, people's anxious responses started to decline, as you do when you realize that there isn't going to be that loud noise, that response. What she found, though, was that those people who had gotten THC began to normalize their response much more quickly. And that's interesting to me and to her because it suggests that whereas a lot of people use marijuana to treat their PTSD symptoms. What she's going after is something that's far more ambitious, and I think she'd admit more theoretical and more speculative, but the possibility that the ingredients of marijuana, whether it's THC or CBD or both, might actually be used in the treatment of PTSD, might be useful in trying to uncouple that memory with memory of a stimulus, like a colored square or a car accident or a trauma, with whatever emotions came up. And I think she'd be the first to admit that she's doing this in laboratory studies. It's not ready for prime time. It's not ready for use in therapy. But she's trying to unpack PTSD, how it works, so we can understand how to begin to treat it at a molecular level.
Speaking of cars, maybe not car wrecks, but we know that cannabis is effective in treating nausea for the side effects of cancer or AIDS treatment. Is the nausea you feel from that different from the nausea you feel riding in the passenger seat of a car?
Yeah, it is. So there are a couple of ways that we can become nauseated. One is through some receptors that are linked to serotonin that occur in the GI tract. So if you have an obstruction, sometimes if you have a viral illness, sometimes chemotherapy works through this route too. Those receptors in the GI tract fire up and cause a sensation of nausea. The sensation of nausea is the same, but can be caused in other ways. For instance, sometimes if you take an overdose of a drug, that drug builds up in the brain and fires receptors in the so-called chemoreceptor trigger zone in the brain. That's kind of a toxin screen or a toxin alert, if you will, which also causes nausea and vomiting. And then the sort of nausea that you get. So all three of those are become nauseated through very, very different pathways, but the end result, the nausea and vomiting part, looks the same. So whenever in my field of palliative care, when we're treating somebody with nausea, we never just reach for one drug. We always try to figure out, well, what's causing this nausea? Is it a side effect of an opioid like morphine, which happens through the middle ear? Is it a side effect of chemotherapy, which happens to the GI tract? And we'd reach for different drugs. And it seems like probably cannabinoids work predominantly through that GI tract, which explains why it's fairly useful for nausea that's associated with chemotherapy. There may be other mechanisms too, but that's been the one that's been studied best.
Well, I have time probably for one other quick question, and it's something I am unclear on. Does cannabis reduce tumors in cancer patients? It's probably a really long answer, but I think we've heard with breast cancer, especially, that's what it's doing. It's either helping the cells die and the tumor to get smaller. What do I have right about that?
The short answer is we're not really sure. About longer answer is in test tubes, in cell culture, in laboratories, yes, it does seem like cannabinoids have some effect on cell division, on cell growth, on cell angiogenesis, the process by which tumor cells create new blood vessels, which they need to grow. So in test tubes, both at the molecular level and at the cellular level, it seems like cannabinoids do slow tumor growth. There's a long step between saying that and actually using it to treat cancer. In fact, I wound up interviewing a woman in Colorado outside of Denver who had a very, very early, very, very treatable form of lymphoma with cure rate probably of 90 or 95%. And she decided to, instead of chemotherapy and radiation therapy, put her trust in concentrated cannabis oil, and just died about 4 or 5 months ago as the book was going to press. Decided to try chemotherapy at the last minute, but it was too late. So yes, there are these stories out there, and it may turn out that someday cannabinoids will be useful in cancer therapy. I wouldn't be surprised, actually. But honestly, anybody right now who has a form of cancer for which there's good treatment available, by all means, feel free to use cannabinoids in addition to that treatment, but I wouldn't put all your hope and trust in that cannabis oil, at least right now.
So I wanted to ask you one other question. I know maybe this might be a sore subject, but you started a Kickstarter campaign to start a website to crowdsource people's experience with cannabis. Do you think people are interested in that right now? That's a similar thing we're trying to do with mjwellness.com is give people a forum for discussing how cannabis has affected their symptoms. Are people looking for this solution? What do you think it feels like out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I still think people are looking for it. I honestly think that the Kickstarter campaign was not the best approach. I think Kickstarter works best for products that people can help support, develop, and then have. I also, frankly, think I didn't manage it well. I put the Kickstarter campaign out there and then was on clinical service for about 3 weeks taking care of patients and basically ignored it, which is not what you do with Kickstarter campaigns.
Right.
But I do think there is interest, and not just stories and anecdotes, but I think some real hard evidence with ratings of symptoms. I'm working now with a venture capitalist who wants to take over that website, merge it with another product that he and others are creating to try to connect patients with each other and with physicians. So I'm hopeful that this idea will take form going forward. Kickstarter just wasn't the right way to do it. But honestly, I really do think there's a need, whether it's marijuana results or MJ Wellness or probably others that will come out there. We certainly don't need just one. I would be delighted if 2 or 3 years from now there are a dozen platforms that are out there that are all helping people to learn from other people's experience and honestly helping researchers to learn. There's a lot of research that needs to be done. We could start doing clinical trials right now, do 20 clinical trials a year, and it would take us decades before we got the data that we needed. So we need some form of patient crowdsourcing to give us advice about where we should put the greatest emphasis in doing clinical trials. And having some form of website where people can describe their symptoms, what's helped, what hasn't, I think that would be really helpful in making research to be more efficient. So I certainly hope that moves forward on a number of fronts.
Well, I think your book, Stoned, has taken us a long way towards that as well. It's the best book I've ever read about medical marijuana use, and it's an entertaining book. I look forward to whatever you write next as well. Really wanted to thank you for joining us today and sharing all this research that you've discovered.
Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure talking. Love your questions. Love your show.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Just Say No. Again, we'd like to thank our guest, Dr. David Cassarette, and for our producers for finding these great guests. You can download episodes of our program by going to cannabisradio.com or subscribing to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or iHeartRadio. You can follow the show on Facebook and Google+. For more information about our guests and to read more about patients using marijuana to control their symptoms and to talk to me, go to mjwellness.com. Make sure to pick up a copy of David Cassarette's new book, Stone. Join us next week when we'll tackle more conditions that can be managed using marijuana therapy.